Good morning, all. Welcome into the program. Great to be with you on a Monday morning. Another week is starting, and it is December, so the last month of the year has begun. I got to tell you, this year has just absolutely flown past for me. I don't know if it was because I was out of work for a while with cancer and chemo and all that, or what else it was, but for whatever reason, this year just feels like it has zoomed right past me. And unfortunately, that does bring me to a somber note, because considering that it is a new year, we've all been blessed with a new day, it is important for us to remember that that is not an opportunity that is afforded to everyone. That's not something that everybody gets. And a sombering reminder of that actually comes from the death of George H.W. Bush. This happened on Friday night, and he was found at his home. He kind of knew that he was going to pass pretty soon, and unfortunately he and the family were aware of this. They knew going into this that this was going to be something that was going to be a big deal, and he died at 94. This was very late Friday night. Just got the news when that happened, and if you were following me on Twitter, you know that we were talking about it quite a bit. He was at his home in Houston, and I'll say this about the president. Didn't always agree with his methods. I didn't always agree with his kinder, gentler approach to conservatism. He was the political rival of a lot of hardcore conservatives like myself, to a degree even the man that he served as vice president for, Ronald Reagan. The Bushes, you have to remember, were the rivals of Reagan in the primaries, and that was something that took place. But here's the thing. Whether I agreed with the guy all the time or not, there's several things that you cannot deny about Herbert Walker Bush. He was an incredible man. A Navy pilot who flew in World War II, a stellar record of not only military service, but also the man was a governor, he was a legislature, he was a businessman. And so just had an incredible life. And had an incredible wife. Of course, Barbara passed back in April this year. And Barbara Bush was just an amazing person, and that whole family is really, really interesting. Now, goodness knows I didn't want Jeb, and W wasn't my favorite president. Like I said, I'm not somebody that just loves the Bushes and thinks that everything they did was magic, but the man was unapologetically American. He loved America, thought it was a great place to live. And he communicated that with other people. He communicated that he loved the ideas of free speech, and he loved the ideas that this nation was founded on. And he lived a life of quiet dignity. I didn't agree with every policy decision he made. I don't think that necessarily Desert Storm was the best idea, or at least not the way that it was handled. It set us up for problems later, I would think. But there are several things that George Herbert Walker Bush did that I think were great. And maybe raising the taxes, which is pretty, I mean, it's fairly certain that that's the reason, him breaking that campaign promise of no new taxes. That's the reason that he didn't get elected, and that was a mistake, in my opinion. But, I mean, you've just got to respect the man's dignity. You've got to respect the way that he talked about people, friend and foe alike. You've got to respect the fact that the man was a patriot. He loved this country. I don't think even his strongest political opponents would disagree with the man being a true patriot, somebody who just loved America and thought it was the greatest country on earth. And there's something to be said for that, because you can't say that about all politicians. There is a unfortunate disdain amongst a lot of people, unfortunately people in my own generation. They're convinced that America is not all that special, it's not that great, it's not that much better than other countries, and it's not that much better than countries throughout history. And I'm just saying to you, look around you, look at all the things that we have, all the things that we are blessed with. You can't tell me doing so and looking at how charitable our people are, that this is not a wonderful country, a wonderful place to live, the best country, in my opinion, in all of human history, primarily because we were founded on the ideas of individual rights. This is something that George Herbert Walker Bush understood very well. And because of that, that really shone through in his presidency and in his dealings with everyday people. He was somebody that was friendly. He was somebody that you could always get along with. And whether or not you personally liked his politics, I don't think that there were too many people that met him that didn't really come away respecting the man. And I do ask that you pray for the Bush family because they are getting hit the hardest by this. I mean, we can sit here and talk about some of his political missteps or his political achievements or the amazing life that he led, and we have done that to a degree. By the way, I do think that the greatest contribution, in my opinion, that George Bush Sr. wound up giving America is Justice Clarence Thomas. I mean, if nothing else, I think that that is a huge tribute to his legacy. In my opinion, the best conservative, and I would say that even if Scalia were still alive and still on the bench. I mean, I love Scalia, I love his opinions, but Justice Thomas has always been my favorite. His opinions, the way that he writes, the guy's just a genius. And I have so much respect for Justice Thomas. And so, if nothing else, that is a major, major accomplishment for America, for people who are true textualists that believe in the Constitution, that believe our laws should be interpreted as intended by those who wrote them. And so, if nothing else, that was a massive contribution to the country. And I believe that George Herbert Walker Bush was somebody that always wanted to put America's interest before everything else, and that is something else that I did admire about the man. We do have a record of George Bush Sr.'s final words, and they were to George W. Bush, his oldest son. Evidently, they knew that this was coming. They knew that it wasn't going to be long before he passed. And I mean, the man was 94 years old and dealing with Parkinson's, which is a particularly nasty disease. I know because my grandmother, that's what wound up ending her life as well. And so I've seen someone go through this. I've seen someone struggle with it. And it is just a horrible disease to have to deal with. It robs you of your memory. It robs you of who you are. And, she would constantly be confused and constantly not understand where she was. And so I can't imagine having to go through this. And so when he was dying, he called his oldest son, George W. Bush, who wasn't there in time. And apparently his last words were, "I love you too." Not necessarily all that profound. Not necessarily some pearl of wisdom or some last word that's going to be mentioned throughout history, like, I don't know, people like Oscar Wilde or other people that had famous last words. But I got to tell you, if I had my choice of last words, and they would be something witty or clever or something people could remember me by, or I got the option to tell someone one last time that I love them, I'd go with that option. And so maybe not things that people will be quoting for generations or anything like that, but you know what? I think that he said exactly what he wanted to say. I think that he got to choose his last words, and that's what he went with. So are we going to be talking about this 20, 30 years from now when we look back at famous quotes from George H.W. Bush or famous presidents? No. But at the end of the day, I think that he got the better deal. I think that he got to say he loved you one last time to somebody that he really cared about in his oldest son. And I think that's far more significant. Unfortunately, in all of this, politics has played a role, and I hate to bring this up because I hate that politics even reared its ugly head in all of this, because whether you agree with somebody or not, there's no reason to speak ill of the dead and bash them, especially so close to the time of this happening. I mean, there will be plenty of times to talk about how much we disagreed with past presidents and past politicians in the history books. But I mean, the day of, or the days surrounding the death, I mean, George H.W. Bush's body is not even buried yet. It's actually being held at the National Cathedral up in D.C., which, by the way, will be where his funeral service is, and then his body will be transported, I believe, to the Presidential Library in Houston, I believe so. I believe that's where it is. That's where his home was. But anyway, so all of that being said, unfortunately, the Associated Press I don't know exactly how this wound up out, but it must have been approved by somebody pretty high up because it made it out onto the Associated Press's official Twitter page. So let's go ahead and look at this tweet. George H.W. Bush, a patrician New Englander whose presidency soared within the coalition victory over Iraq and Kuwait, but then plummeted in the throes of a weak economy. That led voters to turn him out of office after a single term. Has died. He was 94. And I mean, just look at that for a second. It seems like they tried to paint his life and his presidency in as negative a light as humanly possible. And I'm not saying that you've got to memorialize the guy as being perfect or what. I'm not saying that. I haven't done that. I mean, you've been watching the segment. I haven't done that. I pointed out there were some things that he and I did not agree with and some imperfections I think that the man had. But for the AP to just go out of their way to degrade the guy and say he was, just some elitist New Englander, which, by the way, brings me to another point. It is hilarious to me that the media does this to conservatives. They will have them simultaneously be two things at the same time that cannot possibly be the case. For example, this happens with Trump all the time. They'll refer to Donald Trump as somebody who's just a rube, a moron who just kind of stumbled into the presidency. He's not that bright. And they will also simultaneously say he's an evil genius that has all these secret plans that he's running from the background. And I'm just sitting there like, well, you got to pick one. He can't be both. He can't be Lex Luthor and Bizarro Superman all at once. He's either a moron or he's an evil genius or somewhere in between, but he can't be both at the same time. And they do the same thing here with President Herbert Walker Bush. And it just really sickens me that especially this was posted, I believe, the day or less than 24 hours after his passing, where they reported this. And they tried to point out all the negative things about him not getting reelected to a second term. There's no reason to do that, especially so close to his passing. There's a difference in reporting it as a fact and specifically trying to highlight all of the failures in somebody's presidency right after they've passed. There's a very clear political bias. And so one of the things that they do, they kind of take this jab at him early on. They talk about him as this elitist wealthy, well-to-do, privileged New Englander who comes from the halls of power, which, by the way, there is some truth to, but that doesn't mean the man wasn't a hard worker. That doesn't mean the man wasn't a veteran that served his country. I mean, that's not somebody that has exactly been sitting on a velvet pillow his entire life. And so they don't mention any of that. They talk about the fact that he's some rich, snobby New Englander. That's how they try to portray it. And then they'll also, it's funny that the media, when they covered him when he was president and then afterward, they talked about him as some kind of, sort of like his son, George W. Bush, some kind of folksy, hokey, know-nothing rube. And so they'll talk about privilege and talk about how he and his son are both Yale graduates and they went to the Ivy League and they went to all the best schools and how they were very wealthy. All of that is true. But then they'll also criticize them for saying, well, they're just morons. They don't know anything. They were idiots that just kind of backed into the White House, one being a vice president, the other one. No, you've got to pick one. Either he was a white privilege, some guy that just rose up to the top and didn't have to do anything for it, or it's one of the two. You can't have both. He's either one of these elitists or he's somebody that's just a country fried rube, but he can't be both at the same time. And I think the truth is more somewhere in the middle. But the AP did issue an apology for that, where they said, we've deleted a tweet and revised a story. They had a story that went along with that tweet. And revised a story on the death of President George H.W. Bush because of the tweet, and the opening of the story references 1992 electoral defeat and omitted his World War II service. Well, that doesn't really tell the whole story, and it's sort of a half-hearted apology. So, granted, I don't know, a half apology is better than no apology, I guess, but it's better than when people apologize and say, I'm sorry that people were offended, because that basically just means, well, I didn't do anything wrong, I'm sorry you felt that way, but I don't really care, which is not technically an apology. That one is sort of a half apology, but it doesn't really accurately portray exactly what happened. what would have been a better apology or a better way to handle it is said, we apologize for the tweet that highlighted all of George W. Bush's negative attributes and listed none of his positive ones. Because if you're reading that tweet, the way that it reads, the way that it looks is, well, we just kind of accidentally forgot to mention that he served in World War II. There's a very clear political animus against George H.W. Bush in that tweet, and it's on display at the Associated Press, which people kind of hold up as because they're a news wire service, one of the gold standards of just reporting the facts, not giving you any spin. It's very clear that the Associated Press, like most of the mainstream media, has a very obvious left-leaning bend. And that really is unfortunate. In other news, and I do want to mention because there is some local news going on right now, apparently the mall shooting, the mall shooting that took place at Thanksgiving, it would have been Thanksgiving night. That was at the mall in the Galleria in Birmingham, all the Black Friday sales. To give you a quick update, in case you've been living under a rock, what happened is there was a shooting, shots were fired, police went in, and they saw a man, according to the reports, brandishing a firearm, and they shot him. Turns out, though, they found out later when they did some forensics, well, that wasn't the guy that was firing that shot. He may have fired some shots, but he didn't fire any that wound up hitting any of the victims. And so he may have fired some shots, he may not have. We don't have that information. But they have announced that a press conference is going to be held, and actually is being held right now because it's roughly 10:30-ish. So they're holding a press conference right now. Unfortunately, because it was on at the same time as the show, not any news to report, nothing we can report about it, but just know that that press conference is going on, and we will be talking about it tomorrow. So be sure to look for that tomorrow right here on the News Radio 1440 Facebook page. We will be addressing that, and we will talk about some of the news that hopefully we do get some answers, because we have basically been operating with very, very few answers for the past a little over a week now, about a week and a half. And I am really looking forward to digging down and seeing, regardless of what the facts are, let the chips fall where they may. That's what I intend to do. I really want to find out more information on exactly why this took place, because as someone who is a concealed carry permit holder myself, this is something that is of great concern to me. That if this guy really was a licensed CCW and he was just trying to protect people and try to get them out, and a police officer, even if he had the best of intentions, screwed up and wound up shooting somebody that was just trying to help, that wasn't causing a threat or anything, that obviously is something that bothers me, because I could find myself in that position. But again, we're really not sure about that. The facts will be coming out. Aaliyah is supposed to be hosting a press conference right now, and we will bring you all of the news about that. You can watch it yourself today, but we'll be giving you my reaction and my opinion on it tomorrow, and I do look forward to that. We'll give you all the details as soon as that comes out. And another big piece of news that I've got to bring up. They announced it this morning, The Blaze, which was founded by Glenn Beck. He's a talk show host. I'm sure that most of you are aware of him. Used to be on Fox, was on CNN for a while. One of the big three. The big three in conservative talk radio is Glenn Beck, Rush, and Hannity. Hannity and Rush, of course, appearing on our station. Glenn Beck doesn't. But nonetheless, that was announced this morning, and that affects two of our shows here at News Radio 1440. We're still going to be bringing you the same programming. It's not going to change the schedule or anything like that, but they are merging with CRTV, who was founded by News Radio 1440 host Mark Levin. And so now you've got Glenn Beck and Mark Levin, and their two companies are coming together, which means that there are going to be a lot of good things coming forward from this, and it probably means that it is going to affect at least the content of the shows here on News Radio 1440, because not only does it affect Mark Levin, guess who else is aired on CRTV? Rick and Bubba. So you've got two shows that come on News Radio 1440 that are probably going to see an uptick in things like budgeting, an uptick in things like their content, the guest availability that they have, because they're all together in one big house now. This is going to create a conservative media powerhouse. I mean, you talk about a news service that is dedicated to getting the truth out, to conservatism, to constitutionalism. This is going to be the place to be, and I'm very excited about it. Because on the Blaze side, you've got, of course, Glenn Beck, and then you've also got guys like Pat Gray, Stu Burguiere, And so you've also, on the CRTV side, you have a all-star lineup with Mark Levin, one of my all-time favorites, Steven Crowder, Andrew Wilkow, Michelle Malkin, and of course, Phil Robertson and Rick and Bubba. So, I mean, you've just got an all-star lineup there. They're all going to be in one house. Now that means that CRTV, which did not previously have an actual cable station, is going to be there with several cable providers and Dish Network, and they're going to have the radio network as well. I don't know what the lineup is going to be for the online streaming service. As a Blaze subscriber myself, I'm very interested in where that's going. If you do happen to have a Roku or a smart TV of some kind, you'll be able to get this content if you subscribe to the Blaze, and I think it's $9.99 a month, they said, as of today. So this is going on right now. The merger has taken place, and you can watch all the content you want, CRTV, Blaze TV, as long as you have a subscription. So really, really big news in the conservative media world. That's something that I intend to partake in, something that I'm really excited about, and I'm glad that we can plug it here on News Radio 1440 because two of our shows appear on CRTV, now the Blaze Media. So that's going to be the new company name. Really, really big news for conservatives. This is going to be something that I think holds the liberal press accountable because there's some good stuff on Fox. I'm not saying that Fox is all bad or anything, but you do have to remember, and of course one of our other hosts shows up on Fox, that would be Sean Hannity. But you do have to remember when it comes to Fox, Fox is really, especially in more recent years, not so much been a place for conservatives, but really been more of a place for Republicans. And that's okay. I understand you want a big tent, but Fox has been sort of the media branch of the Republican Party. And so because of that, because they've just sort of been a branch of the Republican Party more so than actually being proponents of conservatism, then you get to this point to where, I don't know, it just seems to me that with the Blaze and CRTV combining, that's going to be a far more conservative, more libertarian, constitutionalist leaning network. And I say that based on the personalities that are assembled there. And so really big news in that world, in the conservative media talk show kind of area, and something that I am very much looking forward to. Looks like we have a call on line one, so we're going to go to the phones. Good morning. What's your name?
Hi, it's John.
Hey, what's on your mind this morning?
Just wanted to weigh in on this and get your ideas. Is that just a business move that is a reflection of the time?
You know,
for a need for that? In other words, are we trending toward more conservatism and more constitutional thinking people?
Well, now that's a great question that I could probably spend 30 minutes on, so I'll give you the condensed version as much as I possibly can. There is evidence to suggest that people are getting more conservative. And when I say that, I'm talking about mainly younger people, which is kind of surprising. And you think about it, you've got guys like Ben Shapiro and Steven Crowder, who's actually on CRTV, that their audience is largely younger, conservative, sort of libertarian-leaning folks. And because of that, I really appreciate this merger because you're going to get them and have some of those younger viewers exposed to some of the people they wouldn't normally watch, like Levin, like Glenn Beck. And then the reverse, I think, will also be true. You're going to have some older people, older conservatives that subscribe to this for the first time, and they're going to hear a lot of the people that are more popular with the younger conservatives, like Steven Crowder. I would say Michelle Malkin falls a little bit into that category, and people like Andrew Wilkow. And so you're really going to get this merger, and I think that it's going to be great because it's going to give conservatives and people that are really concerned about the country and about genuine small government are going to be able to come together in a way that they really haven't had a space to come together on before.
Well, how does Rush fit into all of that?
Rush is with the EIB, Excellence in Broadcasting Network, and he owns it and he runs it himself. So basically, Rush is completely independent of that.
Right. I mean, I knew he was independent of that. I just meant as far as one thing that seems to be true is no matter which side you're on, both sides are getting, the conservatives are getting more conservative and the liberals are getting more liberal in their views. I mean, it's more of a less centrist type of mindset that's growing out there. Would you think that's fair?
Yeah, I would say that that's fair to say because, like I said, when I was talking about Fox earlier, we're not really talking about the same thing here, because Fox is a network more for the Republican Party than the people that actually vote Republican. And I think that this would be more towards conservatives specifically, as opposed to just people that may vote Republican. And so, whereas you've got Fox, that's basically sort of the press corps of the Republican side of things, I think this will be far more ideologically sound when it comes to conservatism. Rush, I think, falls somewhere in the middle, because he's more conservative maybe than your average Republican, but he's still sort of that old guard. So, and I'm not bashing the guy. I mean, he's the godfather of radio for a reason. I'm just saying that, you know, he fits more into the old guard side of that.
Yeah. Well, it is interesting, and when I have the habit of listening to Progress Radio, and I know they're getting more liberal.
Yeah.
By the day, and they're going to pick somebody. It sounds like to me they have criteria as far as the president, for example, and that will also be true of other offices in the government, senator, representative, and everything else. They're picking people. They want a wide-based demographic. In other words, they want someone that's alternative lifestyle. They want somebody that's a female. They want somebody that's Hispanic female. They want somebody that's African American female. You know what I'm saying? I mean,
right. You're talking
to base it on that. Has nothing to do with policy, intelligence, aptitude, or anything. It's more about that than anything.
Right. You're talking about this intersectional theory of politics, that the more labels you can stack on somebody, the more valid their opinion is for some reason.
Sure.
But I will say this, and I want to get your reaction to this, because this also happened over the weekend. President Barack Obama was speaking, and he said, I don't remember what network he called out. He may have actually used the Blaze, if I'm not mistaken. He said, if you're somebody that, he was talking about this divide that you're talking about, and he says, if you're somebody that subscribes to the Blaze, I tell you what, just take 20 minutes out of your day and read the Huffington Post or read Think Progress. And what you're talking about, where you listen to Progress Radio, I think that's a good thing. I don't agree with Barack Obama on very much, but I think he's right on that. I don't think it does us any good to get into our own little world. And for the people that are excited about this merger, and I'm consider myself part of that camp, I mean, be excited about it, watch the content, but also look at the other side and get an idea for the other side and what they're doing as well. And I think that that's something that you would agree, since it's something that you've kind of recently got into. It is something that is beneficial to get an idea, ideas that don't necessarily agree with you.
Yeah. Well, one thing is, it's very, very entertaining too, because the outlandish things is kind of like pro wrestling. You can become a fan of it because of that, because it's like listening to conversations between about 5 or 6 8th grade girls.
And you would know that, since you used to teach.
They're incredibly dramatic. Their head's going to explode. They're going to die in the next 5 minutes. It really is like that.
Oh,
I'm not kidding.
I know. I listen to it. I listen to it too. I get it.
They're going to die in the next 5 minutes if Trump stays in office 2 more days.
Yeah.
I mean,
Trump tweeted out that he likes Kim Jong-un's haircut, ergo the world is going to end tomorrow.
Absolutely. That's the most teenage girls I've ever heard of.
All right. Well, thank you.
No matter what they are, but thanks.
Yeah. Thank you for your call. I appreciate it, John from Millbrook. It's true. And that is a problem that I have with progressives in general, but hey, conservatives do it too. It tends to be that sometimes, and I've been guilty of it as well, we overstate things. But I tell you what, I don't hold a candle to progressives. I don't. Because you're talking about progressives, it's just like John from Millbrook is saying, seriously, read Huffington Post, read Think Progress. You can read even some of the slightly more mainstream media. But just take a few minutes out of your day, watch some MSNBC, watch some CNN, and it will give you an idea of what they're like. And they really do freak out over every single little thing. It's actually pretty entertaining. So, when it's even a minute news story, basically anything that Trump has tweeted, anything that Trump has said, and it's hilarious how they'll complain about Trump, but everything revolves around Trump. But anyway, I do think that as far as the media goes, this may be a sign I don't know, that we are tending to go to the polls a little bit more, that we are getting a little more divided. But if that means that there are more people that get to hear a conservative message out of that, I'm not saying that we don't make efforts to reach across. I'm not saying we don't make efforts to try to understand one another, because I think that's really good and really important too. And it's something that I've tried to do myself. But if you're talking about just getting a free exchange of ideas, no matter how different the ideas are, I think that that winds up a good thing. And I say it for conservatives, you need to listen to some liberal media. If you're a liberal, read The Blaze. I wouldn't say read Breitbart, because they have a tendency to kind of do the overzealous, overly reactionary thing. So Breitbart's okay, but I certainly wouldn't recommend it. But listen to Ben Shapiro, listen to Steven Crowder. Just get some ideas and get an idea of what the other side is saying and how they talk, and it really will give you a better idea of how to have a conversation with somebody without being angry with them. And so it really is an insight into how the other side thinks, and I think that that's beneficial for everybody to listen to ideas that don't necessarily agree with them, because sometimes when our ideas are scrutinized, we learn that maybe they weren't quite as solid as we thought, and maybe we should be a little bit more humble and less assured of exactly what we believe. And if we are right, it will strengthen our beliefs because we've had them stand up to scrutiny and they didn't fall apart. That's what real belief is. And that's where it becomes a difference between faith and blind faith. It's okay to have faith. You're supposed to have faith. But blind faith, where you just believe something because it's all that you know or it's all that you've heard before, that doesn't benefit anybody. That being said, we're going to go to a break here in just a second. We'll probably be back in just a couple minutes, and we will finish it out because the trade war is continuing to go on, and it's already caused some casualties. We'll talk about that in a second. And we're back. Thank you so much for holding on with me through the break. And, just figured I'd play a little Christmas music in the musical interlude because, of course, it is December 1st. And now that it's December, it's okay to do that. It looks like we have a caller on line 1, so let's go ahead and go to the phones. Good morning. What's your name?
Laura Glidewell, the Christmas expert.
Oh, yeah, my former co-host, Laura Glidewell. Yes. What's on your mind this morning?
Well, I was just reading some very deep news. I was looking at Business Insider and also Unilad, Independent, Travel and Leisure. Anyway, but I've been very well researched. And, of course, I'm seeing that people who listen to Christmas music earlier are scientifically proven to be happier.
Yeah, that can't be true.
I'm just telling you, I'm looking at a massive list of sources.
Yeah. Well, so here's the thing. For those of you who may not be aware of it, Laura and I had this long-running spat on our show that it was not allowed to have any Christmas music on the show until December 1st. And so I guess she heard my Christmas music playing and decided to weigh in and be a smart aleck about it. So
it's high time that you listen to Christmas music.
Well, it is time. It's past December 1st, so I'm perfectly okay with it.
I've been listening to it since July.
I know. I had an aunt one time that we would ride around in her, I think it was a Ford Tahoe, doesn't really matter anyway. She had this Billy Gilman Christmas album that she listened to year round, and we would go visit her for the 4th of July. She'd have it playing.
That is genius and wonderful. I don't understand why you are not following this example.
I find it sad.
Bad? How is that bad?
Look, now, here's the thing. I love Christmas. You know I love Christmas. But yeah. I think that it has its time and place. 25 days is enough.
I don't know. Think about it like this. Okay, so at Christmas we celebrate Jesus' birth, right?
Well, I don't, but you may.
Well, but we both know that Jesus wasn't born in December.
Sure.
So theoretically, if we just celebrate it year-round like we're supposed to, we can listen to Christmas music year-round.
Well, I celebrate Jesus' birth year-round. I just don't do it with Christmas music.
You know what? Santa heard you say that, and I'm pretty sure you're getting a lump of coal.
Probably. But I do that every year, so it's not a big deal.
Likely true.
All right. Thanks, Laura. Anything else you wanted to add today?
Yeah, Merry Christmas to you all, and to all a good day.
Yeah, it's not really nighttime, but okay.
Dang.
Well, thank you, Laura.
Right.
I appreciate it. No happy holidays around here. We say Merry Christmas.
Exactly. Merry Christmas, Caleb.
All right. Merry Christmas, Laura. Bye. Thanks for calling in. Laura Gladwell, ladies and gentlemen. So it was nice of her to call in. I haven't heard from her in, on the air, I haven't heard from her in a while. We had lunch the other day. But anyway, back to the actual news of the day. You may have heard that Trump's trade war has continued to escalate, and unfortunately, it's not really 100% yielding the results that he was sort of hoping for there. So GM has decided that they are going to move several jobs to China, and Trump has just been absolutely furious about this whole thing. He went on a Twitter tirade. He's talked about it in public. He does not like the fact that GM is going to be moving a lot of their factories and a lot of their jobs overseas, which is understandable. Not saying that it's completely unjustified, but when they announced that GM is going to be laying off about 15% of its labor and shuttering about 5 of their plants in North America to China and other places around the world, especially because it was China, because, Trump, China, he really doesn't like China. So the fact that it was moving to China just, I think, stung a little extra. And that's one of the reasons that the president really did not like that. So one of the things that he did was he threatened the other day that if this took place, what he was going to do is pull subsidies. And what he was specifically referring to is Chevy and GM, because, of course, they're all one company. They're receiving certain subsidies for electric cars, like the Chevy Volt. And here's the thing. I'm for him pulling the subsidies, but not as a retaliation for moving abroad. He should be pulling the subsidies regardless. If GM says, you know what, we are going to stay in America, Trump should still say, yeah, you're still not getting subsidies. The idea that we would be subsidizing electric cars is stupid. It's an Obama-era policy. And by the way, it's not just Obama. George W. Bush did the bailouts too. And so they were bailing out the auto industry. And this idea that we ought to be subsidizing electric cars is beyond dumb. Because here's another thing. Who are the vast majority of those buying electric cars? Now, there are exceptions to this rule, of course, but it's primarily rich people. And so what's hilarious about this is that Barack Obama, the guy that was all for redistribution of wealth and helping the middle class, and we should be using our taxpayer dollars to help people, the cars that he was subsidizing were cars that were purchased by rich people. That's how much, it makes no sense whatsoever. So instead of subsidizing, a Toyota, or subsidizing a Hyundai, or a car that I would even be fine with American cars. If we were subsidizing something like, a Chevy Malibu, that would be one thing, because that's something that a person that may not necessarily be making all that much money. I'm against subsidies altogether. You guys know that. But at least then it would be subsidizing cars that people that are poorer tend to buy. You're subsidizing cars that are basically just luxuries for the rich. It makes no sense whatsoever, and yet we continue to do it because we're continuing on the Obama-era policy of doing so. And let's be honest about this. This is one of the reasons that corporate welfare is stupid. All it does is stave off the inevitable. When we were actually funneling government money into GM and into Chrysler Dodge, they were reaping the benefits of free taxpayer money, or at least, at the very least, a loan at very low interest rates. To subsidize a company, all that did was stave off the job loss. It was always coming. And for that exact same amount of money, we probably could have just paid the people to work for the government at that point. This is the reason that corporate bailouts don't work, and that corporate welfare is stupid. Because all it does is put a Band-Aid on the problem at great cost to the taxpayer, probably greater cost to the taxpayer than it would be to just let whatever it was that was going to happen. And so if you're saying, well, you can stay in this country because we want the jobs, but we're going to pay you this much for the jobs, well, that doesn't make any sense. We could just pay the people to have jobs here, whether in the government or something else, for that amount of money. Or we could just let the free market actually do what it's supposed to do and restructure those companies and allow jobs to go overseas, which creates more jobs in other sectors. For example, nobody likes the idea of outsourcing, but there are certain ways where it's economically beneficial and it helps with jobs. So if you're importing all kinds of new products from other countries, well, somebody's got to ship it over here. And somebody's got to be a retailer, because if you don't have retailers, then you're not going to be able to sell the product here anyway. And if you're doing so at a lower price, that means you can hire more retailers, you can buy more advertising, whatever else it is that you want to do. And so this trying to curtail and trying to embrace this idea of protectionism, that we're going to try to keep these jobs in the United States, that keeps other jobs from being made in other sectors. It doesn't make any sense. Because now we are losing jobs that we would have in other parts of the economy that would be a better allocation of scarce resources, which is really what economics is when you boil it all down. It is the allocation of scarce resources that have alternative uses. That's really all it is. And what we're doing is we're taking resources and using them in an inefficient way, funded by the government, to prop up a failing business, or to prop up a business to engage in activities that cost more. Because if they didn't cost more, then they wouldn't be doing them. And so we're intentionally making things cost more for no reason. And here's another thing. Part of the reason that GM is doing this is because of the high steel tariffs. Because if they're operating in China, then they can get steel at a cheaper price. GM has already estimated, since the tariffs have been put into place, which didn't even begin until almost the middle of this year, just since then, they've already lost $1 billion. Because when steel goes up, their prices go up. The price of a car goes up. And when that happens, demand drops, which means you sell less cars. And so GM has already lost, to their estimation, over $1 billion in steel tariffs. This is why tariffs are stupid. Because yes, it props up one business, but it does so at the expense of everybody else. The only person that wins in tariffs is the government, because they get tax money out of it. That's it. You pay more for your products, and it costs jobs. Everything that's associated with the market distortion happens because of tariffs. Everything that's associated, just like any other market distortion, whether it's raising the minimum wage, whatever else it may be, tariffs do exactly the same thing, usually worse, actually. So this is not all President Trump's fault. I'm not trying to lay GM moving all at his feet, because like I said, Barack Obama and George W. Bush played a large role in it. And it does kind of suck that we invested about $1 trillion into these companies. I think it was $1 trillion overall, if you're looking at them and Chrysler. And then GM's just like, nope, we're good. See ya. We're out. Well, then what was the point of us propping you up in the first place? And again, that's exactly why corporate welfare is dumb, because you don't always see an adequate return for your investment. And at best, it just slows down the problem. It doesn't actually stop it. So you have a slowed down problem that still winds up occurring anyway, and you spent all this money to do it. It's a horribly inefficient way to try to bolster an economy, and usually does the exact opposite, which we're seeing right now. So here's another issue, because Trump is really upset about this, and he's talking about trade deficits. Well, trade deficits in and of themselves are not bad. I've said this, I don't know how many times. You know what country has a massive trade deficit right now? America. You know what country has a massive trade surplus right now? Venezuela. So obviously a trade deficit or a trade surplus is not in and of itself a measure of whether or not we have good trade deals or bad trade deals, or whether or not our economy is strong or weak. Because obviously we're getting an awful lot of money. And that means we're spending a lot of that money overseas for products, which means we have a trade deficit. If you go out and buy gasoline from your local gas station today, unless you sell them something, you have a trade deficit with the gas company. Why? Because you've determined that the money in your pocket is worth less to you than the gasoline that you could purchase for said money. Ergo, you engage in a free market trade where you say, I want gas, you have gas, here's the money, give me some gasoline. And the other guy essentially says, okay, because I have gas and I'd rather have your money than the gasoline that I have, so I'll take your money. And then you engage in that trade, and then you both go off on your merry way, both feeling like you won. That guy feels like he won because he got the sale and he got the money that he wanted. You feel like you won because you got the gasoline that you needed. Ergo, both of you walk away from that trade feeling like you got the better deal. That's the way a mutually beneficial trade is supposed to work. Trump, unfortunately, has this weird idea that trading is a zero-sum game, and if you're winning, then the other guy is losing and vice versa. And so he feels like if you're engaging in trade, there's a winner and a loser in this case, and that is not the way that trade works. And unfortunately, he has carried this over, but despite all this, because he was complaining about trade deficits and saying, we have to drive down the deficit, we have to get to where we're not importing nearly as many goods. Well, ironically, the trade deficit went up after his tariffs. This is according to a report. Deficits are not necessarily a bad thing at all, and I understand that. I agree with that. I don't think that the trade deficit going up is necessarily a bad thing. But the whole goal of his tariff plan was to lower those deficits. And for 5 straight months now, we've had a growth in the deficit, and it is expected to hit we're going to hit a deficit high by New Year's. So clearly, not only are the tariffs not making the economy better, they're not even doing what Trump promised they would do. Which, if the deficits is lowered, that would be neither a good thing or a bad thing. It just depends on which trades we're making. But even though I don't have a problem with the deficit being high, even Trump, who said that that was the whole purpose of tariffs in the first place, has seen deficits rise for 5 months straight and is about to hit a record high, deficits we've never seen before. There is a $1 billion deficit growth in October and $200 billion after those $200 billion worth of tariffs started in China. So we've had over $1 billion in deficit growth. Now, granted, possibly part of the reason for this is it was exasperated by Trump's threat to hike tariffs, and that's no longer on the table, which is good, because it means that right now what's happening is that because of this new development, that Trump has said we're going to put a pause on the tariffs. He met with President Xi. I like to call him President 11 because his name is XI. But President Xi, he met with him the other day and said, we're going to take 3 months, put a pause on the tariff hikes from 10% to 25%, and we're going to try to sort this out. I hope that's a good sign. I hope that that means that we're going to wind up bringing down trade barriers with China. And one thing that he has talked about, which I do applaud the president on, I do think that he's doing the right thing on, is he talked about intellectual property rights with China. Now, that is a big deal because China has essentially no respect for copyright laws. And when America invents something and they try to bring that product into China, they basically say, well, you can bring it in here if you want to, but if you do, we're not going to protect your copyright laws, and anybody that gets their hands on it can mass produce it and sell it to the Chinese, which makes it much harder for American companies to actually turn a profit when expanding into markets like China. Because people make a knockoff that's exactly the same as your product that they did no research for, that they didn't have to develop themselves, and so they can undercut you on cost. And that's not fair. That's not right. And so one of the things that Trump has talked about is trying to get that fixed. And now if he does that, that's a big win. And that's a big win for free trade and the free economy. But, let's see if that takes place. If it does, excellent. I'm all for it. But right now, I'm skeptical. I'm cautiously optimistic. We'll say it that way. I want to err on the side of being optimistic, and we'll try that. So Trump has a new trade deal out that he announced and signed just the other day called the USMCA, which is going to be the replacement for NAFTA, which was signed at the G20 summit just this weekend. Now, technically, even though all 3 presidents, well, I say that, the president of the United States, of course, the president of Mexico, and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, they all signed it, but in all 3 of the countries, it still has to pass their legislatures. So in none of the 3 countries that signed is it actually law. This is just an agreement reached by the executives of those countries. So what we're going to see in the coming days is Congress, if they're going to approve it or not. And technically, it's still going to have to clear that hurdle in all of the countries to be official. But Trump has called NAFTA, quote, the worst trade deal ever made in the history of the world. And the irony in all of that is, all 3 countries greatly benefited and saw economic increase after NAFTA went into effect. Specifically, with goods and services that were traded across borders. And so actually what NAFTA did was it lowered trade barriers in all countries, and all countries saw an economic boost in it. Mexico has seen an increase in quality of life. America has done the same thing. Canada saw it open up in new markets. They had all kinds of new markets that they could go into, specifically things like timber. And so they were making all kinds of money on all three fronts. And that's the way a mutually beneficial trade deal should look like. And here's the irony in all this. Despite Donald Trump saying that it was one of the worst trade deals in all of human history, he basically just made NAFTA 2.0. His new agreement, which is supposed to be a replacement for NAFTA, which is this horrible deal. According to it's terrible, it's horrible, it's the worst. It's supposed to be this horrible deal, and yet President Trump's version of the deal is 90% the same. That's according to an economist named Gary Huffbar, who is he's not a left-winger or anything. The guy's a free trade economist. He likes free markets. He's a big C capitalist. And he's saying, yeah, I'm looking at the deal and it's 90% what NAFTA was. There's some tweaks and there's some things that are different, but by and large, it's just NAFTA. And so it is really funny. President Trump has spent all this time talking about how terrible NAFTA is, and his law or his deal that he came up with is essentially exactly the same. So let's talk about a handful of the things that are different. One thing it did do is it did lower some tariffs on some ag commodities like dairy in Canada, which you may remember we talked about Friday. Well, that's a really good thing, but the primary beneficiary of that is Canada. Again, not a problem for me. That's mutually beneficial. We get to sell more of our dairy in their country. Their people get to pay less money for dairy. It is a win-win. And so I'm perfectly okay with that, but it's ironic that it didn't really hurt American farmers that much because there were other buyers that were willing to get our dairy and our other products. And so bringing down those trade barriers primarily helped Canada, not us. But that's fine. I'm okay with that. It's funny that Trump is touting this as a huge win for America. And it also raised the amount, and this one I'm really having problems with. It also raised the amount of auto parts manufactured here from 62.5 to 75%. So now, under this new deal, 75% of cars sold in the United States have to be manufactured here in America. That's an arbitrary, unnecessary regulation on the auto industry. There's no reason that should be the case. 75%, that's ridiculous. And 40 to 45% of the car must be made by high-wage people earning $16 per hour or its equivalent. Again, this is really stupid. It makes just as much sense as having a minimum wage hike to $15 an hour. Having a market distortion like that and artificially saying this is what your labor must be worth to you doesn't make any sense. People will pay what the labor is actually worth. And when they do so, it is going to benefit all parties involved. But up until that point, the idea that the government can somehow mandate that certain jobs have to pay this amount or this amount of the product has to be made by people making this much money, no, they will pay what it is worth to them or that job will cease to exist. And eventually, when these market distortions come into effect, that's exactly what happens. That those jobs that you cannot anymore hire somebody for less than that amount, they just wind up not hiring that person. And so instead of somebody making $14 an hour, they make $0 an hour. How is that an improvement? Then they just don't have a job. And so people have less products that they're paying more money for, and there are people that would have had a job otherwise that now don't have a job. This is why market distortions and things like minimum wages are so incredibly stupid, because it takes a lot of free will and economic freedom out of the marketplace. It also, this deal increased imports of quotas by eggs and poultry products. Again, I don't understand the whole thing of quotas, that you have to import this amount. If Canadians want our products, they're going to buy more of them. If they don't, they won't. Quotas really doesn't help us in any significant way. And this really all goes back to one principle that neither Donald Trump nor most Democrats, and Republicans for that matter, really do not understand. Centralized planning is no replacement for a free market. There is no way that a bunch of bureaucrats in Washington can accurately predict the behavior of 320 million people. They just can't do it. And so leaving that to the free market and allowing prices to dictate how the market moves is a far more efficient system. It does for free what it cost us millions of dollars to try to get people in Washington to do, and it does it better. And so this idea that somehow these elites in DC, and I'm including Trump in this, that these elites in DC can get together in a room and decide what people will buy and what people won't buy and how much of it they're going to buy and how much of it they're going to make here and how much of it they're going to make there. A market does that all for free, and it does it more efficiently. Centralized planning is no replacement for that. It never has been, and it never will be, because it cannot predict all the eventualities of the future, and it also cannot predict people and what they want and how they want to spend their money. And because it can't predict that, then we should leave it to the magic of the free market. Trump has threatened to pull out of NAFTA if Congress doesn't approve it. This is just so beyond reason to me, because what he has said now is because Congress has to approve the New Deal. He says that if Congress does not approve this deal, then he is going to pull NAFTA out, and then we'll just have pre-NAFTA conditions. That is so beyond stupid. That's going to wind up hurting us. That's like saying, I am going to hurt the citizens of this country if I don't get my way. Now, again, I don't think that this is a horrible deal. It's a mixed bag. I think there's some things about it I really like, and there's some things about it that I really detest. But it's certainly not worth hurting the entire country over. It's not worth holding the country hostage and saying, if you don't do this, then we're just going to go back to pre-NAFTA conditions, and we're going to have whatever it was before then, increase in tariffs. That is not going to be good for the economy. I'm not trying to overstate things. I don't think that it's going to destroy the economy or completely derail it or anything like that. But it is going to mean higher cost for everyday products for Americans. And the fact that Trump is willing to even entertain that idea unless he gets exactly what he wants, to me just comes off as childish. You should not be willing to hurt the citizens to get a bill in place that's largely just a cosmetic change. And rest assured, that's actually what Trump really wants. He wants the cosmetic change. He wants to be able to take credit for it, and that's why he wants the name to change. Because once the name changes, then it's really his baby, and he can take credit for it, and he can point to that and say, see, look at this awesome thing that I did, even though it's 90% exactly the same as what we had before. That's really what he wants. He's a marketer. That's the kind of person that he is. And so because of that, he really wants the win, but wanting the win at the expense of other people is just really dumb. Now, to President Trump's credit, he has gotten a little bit better on trade, but it seems to me that he has this unfortunate belief that that tariffs, for whatever reason, are ultimately good. And that's not good, because the tariffs, like we've mentioned, they're starting to take away jobs, they're starting to cost American workers and American consumers, and at the end of the day, it's just much easier and a much better policy to adopt free trade. The president has said in the past that that's his eventual goal, that's eventually where he wants to get to. Hey, if that's true, I'm all for it, and I hope that he gets there. I just do not think that tariffs are going to be an effective way to get us to that point. With that said, we're going to go straight to the Daily Dose of Stupid, and this one is a doozy.
That was stupid.
I know it was stupid.
Really stupid.
Hey, I just said it was stupid.
So the Daily Dose of Stupid today, there is a new feminist Bible out, and you know I'm going to have a field day with this one. So a group of 20 feminist theologians have gotten together and have written a new Bible. So these 20 feminists are going to get together and decide what God really meant when he was inspiring the authors of the gospel. That ought to be fun. You're really going to write a book that's an improvement on the one that was written by an almighty, all-knowing God. Good luck with that one and your finite human minds. Not saying I could do better. I'm just saying the idea that they're going to improve upon what God made is just laughable. So these 20 feminists got together and they said that they are proposing a woman's Bible. They've already released it. It came out earlier this year. And their stated purpose, and this is according to them, is to challenge the patriarchal interpretations of the scripture. Okay, so at first glance, maybe there's some hope here. If all you're doing is challenging some interpretations that you think might have gone awry, in other words, the people that are interpreting them, not the scriptures themselves, but the people interpreting them made a mistake, and there's a different way to look at it, then I'm open to hearing that. In fact, a lot of my discussions in Bible classes that I teach are specifically talking about that, because misinterpretation of the scripture does happen. And so because of that, it's important for us to really understand exactly what the Bible means and make sure that it's reliable. So let's observe one of their big claims. One of their claims comes from Luke chapter 10, 38 and 41. And I'll go ahead and read this just in the New American Standard. And you tell me what you think about it. So Luke 10, 38 through 41. Now as they were traveling along, he entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. She had a sister called Mary, who was seated at the Lord's feet listening to his word. But Martha was distracted with all her preparations, and she came up to him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the serving alone? Then tell her to help me. But the Lord answered and said to her, Martha, Martha, you are worried and bothered about so many things. So, according to their version of this particular passage in the Woman's Bible, they bring up that the Greek word for serving that is used here, and this is in the original Koine Greek, is diakona. And that could mean that she was a deacon. That's their argument, that Martha was actually a deacon. Even though we think about it as her serving food, what really is going on is it's referring to her as a deacon. Well, the problem with that is the context of the entire rest of the scripture. They are over there, and Martha is serving her guest because there's a house full of people. And by contrast, Mary is there listening to Jesus' teaching while Martha is doing something else. Now, it's true that the word there could be interpreted to ministering, which wouldn't necessarily be serving food, but serving people in a certain way. But if you're looking at the context of the verse, it certainly appears as though she was attending to her guests. And furthermore, if you understand the historical culture in which this took place, whether you like it or not, whether you agree with it or not, the simple fact is that back then, it would have been a female's role to engage in that. Again, you may think that that's outdated, you may think that that's old, you may think that that's not right, but regardless of whether you agree with the practice or not, it was the practice of the time. For example, it would not be right for me to look at one of the scriptures that talks about slavery and for me to say, well, you know what? I think slavery is wrong, so what they meant was that it probably wasn't a slave. Well, that may not be an accurate interpretation of the history of the scripture. If it was somebody that was a slave, for example, if we were talking about the story of Joseph, he was a slave. I think that slavery is wrong. I don't think that the practice was good when the Egyptians did it, but it doesn't change the fact that just because it offends me or makes me uncomfortable, that it gives me the right to say, no, that's not what they meant. And furthermore, there's a couple other problems with the interpretation that she was a deacon. First of all, if you're looking at passages like Acts 6:1, where you see, and by the way, this was talking about men serving food to people. And so it is used in that context where it specifically talks about food. And so the idea that we should rule out the idea that Martha was serving food is not biblically accurate, even if you're looking at other scriptures that describe it that way, that use that Greek word in that way. And even if she were not serving food, even if it was talking about ministering to them in some other way, for example, maybe she's washing their feet or taking their coats or whatever else it was that she was doing to take care of her guest, the implication here is that she was not worried about something spiritual. She was worried about the comfort of her guest when Mary was doing the better thing, when she was not worrying and she was actually taking this opportunity to learn at Jesus' feet. Furthermore, you also have another big problem. There were no deacons at this time. Being a deacon, male or female, was not a thing. Because deacons were not established until the church was established. And when was the church established? After Jesus' death on the day of Pentecost, 50 days after the resurrection of Jesus Christ. 50 days after the crucifixion of Christ, because it would have been 50 days after Passover. So obviously it took 3 days and then he resurrected. But you understand what I'm saying here. That it would have been at least months to years before this actually happened and the church was established, before there would be any deacons. So the idea that this verse is referring to Martha as a deacon, nope, sorry. There is absolutely nothing in the scriptural record at all to back that up. And when you eliminate the impossible, whatever else that is left is probably true. So it's impossible that she was a deacon. So she was ministering to her guest at least in some way. That probably included serving food. Could have included serving them in other ways, but the point is she was serving them in such a way that she was ignoring the teaching of Jesus there and paying more attention to her guest and hosting them than she was the message. So that's really becomes the problem. Also, another big problem that you run into is that 1 Timothy 3:8, verse 10, and verse 12, all three of those verses assert very clearly that deacons are men. One of the qualifications for being a deacon is to be a man, at least in these particular verses. And so you've got all kinds of evidence to the contrary of that. And so they're basically, they have an ideology and they're changing the Bible to fit their ideology. So they have an issue with taking, with women in the Bible being, quote, portrayed in a negative light as servants or prostitutes who dance for a king or kneel before Jesus' feet. All right, I have a couple problems with that statement. First of all Christians are supposed to worship at Jesus' feet. Male, female, doesn't matter. So the idea that you have a problem with kneeling at Jesus' feet and worshiping him shows me that you're not real concerned with Christianity in the first place, because that's something we're all supposed to do. That's something that I'm supposed to do as a man. That is a subjugation that I'm supposed to put myself into, because Jesus is my Lord and my Savior, and that's what he deserves. He deserves and encourages worship. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. So here's my question to them. Should we retroactively just revise all women? And I'm not even talking about biblical women at this point. I'm talking about just all women in history. Is that really what you want? That all women from now on in history must be portrayed as perfect and not having any problems? Because there's prostitutes and people that dance in secular history. Should we just erase that and pretend like that never happened? The Bible does portray some women as prostitutes. Why? Because some women in the Bible were prostitutes. It's portraying them accurately. Doesn't say that all women were. In fact, a lot of the biblical women, I would even argue that probably most. I don't think that it mentions but a few women that were actually prostitutes. And as far as women dancing around for the pleasure of men, I can only off the top of my head think of 2 instances where that was suggested. And both times, it was by a man who was a bad guy. King Herod, and it would have been King Xerxes. That's in the book of Esther, and then later, the guy who executed John the Baptist for Salome. So both times that happened, those were bad guys. And so they seem to be completely glossing over that whole thing. And when you talk about, well, the Bible only paints women in a negative light. Oh, really? What about Sarah, or Rachel, or Rebecca, or Miriam, or Zephora, or Yoheved, or Ruth, or Esther, or Abigail, or Hannah, or Rahab, or Mary, or Elizabeth, or Martha, or Chloe, or Deborah, or Priscilla? What about Tabitha? I mean, we could go on and on and on and on and on. There are a myriad of wonderful Christian examples, or strong Jewish women in the Old Testament's case, of strong women that took leadership roles, that had a great influence, that were godly, that were chaste, that were models of godliness. And for this negative connotation that, well, it just portrays women as weak and it's a patriarchal, and no, it portrays women exactly the way that women ought to be portrayed. And it does the same for men. The Bible takes a swing at a lot of men. Why? Because they deserved it. Because they were bad. The Bible doesn't sugarcoat things. It depicts characters exactly as they are, good and bad. And for the idea that there's something inherently wrong with the Bible because it says some bad things about some of the women contained within them, well, if you want a book just filled with perfect people, then that defeats the purpose of having a Bible in the first place. There's only one perfect person in the Bible, and that's Jesus Christ. And this idea that we need to be revising history and changing what actually happened to fit your sensibilities is beyond stupid. And I would say that even if this were just secular history. Everything you need to know about what they believe about the Bible is summed up in this one quote. This is Elizabeth Paraminer, who is one of the two women that was the head of this whole project. She said, quote, "We are fighting against all literal reading of the text." Really? All literal reading of the text? You don't think that any of the text should be read literally? "We are fighting against a literal reading of the text. It's like taking a letter someone sent to give advice as being valid for all eternity." Oh, I get it. So what you're saying is we need to update the Bible because an all-knowing God that can see the future couldn't have possibly seen how people in the future would have understood the text. Look, if you don't like that and you think that these moral teachings that are being put here should be updated to change with the times, then there was no point in writing them down in the first place. If the Bible was supposed to change with the times, then there would be no point in the Bible. There would be no point in any historic document. You write stuff down because you want them to be preserved. If you didn't want them preserved, if you wanted the world to just come up with its own morality every 5 years or so, then there is no reason to write down a Bible. It defeats the whole purpose of having text in the first place. You write it down so that other people will be able to read it at a later time. And that's true of any historic text, whether you're talking about the Constitution, whether you're talking about any kind of history, it needs to be understood in the way that the author is intending for it to be understood of the audience at that time. And when you're talking about the morality of the Bible's morals are eternal. They don't have an expiration date. It's not like God is saying, well, it's immoral to do this. I might change my mind on that later. It's wrong to do it now. Later, yeah, you guys will probably figure it out. You'll probably figure out that I made a mistake. That's not how Scripture works. And it just defeats the entire purpose. You don't update the Bible to fit your own personal sensibilities because things make you uncomfortable. That's not the way the Bible is. You can argue against the Bible or for it, but you cannot say that it's okay to just change it based on what you want, because that defeats the purpose of having it. And that would defeat the purpose of having any historic document. We are supposed to change our beliefs based on what the Bible says. We're not supposed to change what the Bible says based on our own beliefs. We've got this whole process backwards. And that's the issue that I really take with it. And that being said, that is a good segue into the chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Now, this morning's Chaplain's Report, I think it's very appropriate, and I did not plan this. I really didn't, because you'll remember for the past 2 days, the past two Chaplain's Report we have had, which started on Wednesday, was on the book of Ruth. And I wasn't doing that in preparation for this. I had no idea this article was going to come to my attention. But Ruth is one example of a wonderful woman, and her mother-in-law Naomi also, for the way that a godly woman is supposed to act. And there's some powerful messages communicated in the book of Ruth. So let's look at Ruth 2, 1 through 3. So you may remember, just to kind of set the stage here, this is when Ruth and Naomi have decided to return to Israel. So, my apologies.
No, you messed it up.
There we go. Don't know why my software was messing up on me there. I apologize. So, Ruth 2, 1 through 3. Now Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a man of great wealth of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, "Please let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after one in whose sight I might find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she departed and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she had happened to come to the portion of the field belonging to Boaz, who was a member of the family of Elimelech. So this is sort of a God and Naomi working together to play matchmaker here. I don't know that Naomi necessarily intended for her to wind up in this area, but it's not surprising that since they returned to Israel and Naomi was evidently the one doing the leading, that they wound up in the area that she was familiar with. So this is someone who is a relative of Naomi's, a man of great wealth named Boaz. And because they come back to this place, it just so happens, which I believe is God's way of saying divine providence, that Ruth happens to wind up in the field of this man named Boaz. So this communicates a couple of messages here, because you'll see that Ruth has a desire to go into the field of someone whom she might find favor of. So she's going into the fields of those that are more fortunate than she is, because at this point she and Naomi are essentially beggars. Because gleaning was a process where people would leave the corners of their fields, and they would allow that so that people that didn't have any money or didn't have a way to support themselves, they would go into the fields and take those which the reapers left. So you would intentionally leave a portion that you could reap, but you left it for other people that were less fortunate. And so she does this and goes into there, and I think this gives a very powerful message to both men and women. The message to women, I think, is that you need to seek out a man that can provide for you. This is actually a principle that the Bible talks about. When you are going after a man, when you're looking for someone, you need someone that you know is going to have your back and is going to be willing to work to provide for you and to take care of you. And this is especially true because eventually, in most marriages, there comes children. And so because of that, then you're going to have even more mouths to feed. And so if he can't provide for you and he can't take care of you, imagine how useless he's going to be when there's 2 or 3 kids. And so this is a message is saying, ladies, if you do want to set yourselves up for success, if you want to get a mate that is going to be good for you, you need to pick a man that is willing to do the work and is able to provide for you. Because if you are going to marry him before then, if you're going to marry him and you know that he's not really providing for you and you know he's not really doing what he's supposed to do, that just encourages bad behavior. That enables him. Because I know this is unflattering of men, but I am a man and I know how the male brain works. This guy is sitting here thinking, I don't really have to try all that hard with her. I mean, I can just kind of sit here and do nothing or do the bare minimum and she's still with me. So I don't know, guess I don't have to work real hard. And I'm not saying that women need to constantly nag or berate the men that they're with to provide more things or to get luxuries. And I'm not even saying that you have to be a man like Boaz, a man of great wealth, but you do have to be able to take care of people. And this is a basic truth of humanity that Ruth understands. And because of that, she seeks out a mate that she knows is going to have the means to provide for her and any children that they may one day bear, which is really good for us because eventually Ruth becomes a part of the lineage of David and the lineage of Jesus Christ as well. So not necessarily giving yourself over completely to a guy who is not willing to provide for you is going to encourage him to do better and to improve his own life and to be able to provide and work harder. Because doing so before this takes place, that's not loving someone, that's enabling them. That is enabling them to continue in their bad behavior. And it also gives a powerful message to men as well. To men, you're supposed to be kind, the kind of man that can provide for other people. This is part of your role. And the Bible asserts this in other places as well. Doesn't mean your wife doesn't help. In fact, when it talks about godly women, this is somebody that does a lot around the household. This is somebody that does a lot to help you and to keep the family together. So it doesn't mean that the wife doesn't have a part to play, but it does mean that you are the primary provider for this particular situation when you are in a marriage like this. But you have to keep in mind you are the stronger vessel. This is something that is mentioned in 1 Peter 3:7. You are supposed to be, because you have a physically stronger body, you're supposed to be the one that is the primary breadwinner for this. And I'm not saying that it always has to be this way, but generally speaking, men are supposed to be this way. And if you can't find a good woman, this may be why. If you're not able to provide for yourself, if you're not able to provide for another person, then this may be the reason that you're having trouble in a relationship, because women instinctively, even if they wouldn't say this, they do know that they need a man that can provide for them and take care of them if it comes to that. And they are well justified in desiring that. That's something that God put in them intentionally, and acknowledges this in Ruth. Women really want useful men. And this is something that Jordan B. Peterson has talked about a lot. You may remember that I've referenced him. He's a clinical psychologist and a professor at Toronto University. Really great thinker. I just recently read one of his books. It turns out, in one of his studies, he wanted to find out, are women actually attracted to wealth? And he did several surveys where there would be men that were wealthy, but not necessarily useful. For example, a man that won the lottery and had a continuous payout. So he was always going to be wealthy, but he wasn't very useful. And then they did comparisons with somebody like him and somebody that was wealthy, but was useful, but not necessarily wealthy. Somebody that was working for a nonprofit, but he was doing really good work. It just wasn't necessarily work that paid all that well. And it turns out that women were far more attracted to the guy that was useful than they were the man that was wealthy. And so women typically use wealth as an indicator, and there's exceptions to this. Some women actually do want the wealth. But women typically use wealth as an indicator of how useful you are. And so it's not that most women are attracted to money or attracted to the wealth. They're actually attracted to useful men. And this is a good and natural instinct that the Lord put in them. And we're seeing Ruth kind of play that out in her practice of going to the field of those who are more fortunate, trying to find favor in someone's sight. The duty of man is to love God and to obey him. And part of that does include taking care of his family and taking care of the people in his life. We are caregivers. We are protectors. We are guardians. That's who God made us to be. And if we aren't that person, in a sense, we're disobeying God. That's something very serious to think about. We need to be men like Boaz. Not necessarily that we have to be wealthy, but we do have to be able to provide enough for ourselves and to be able to help others. And that is something also that is mentioned in Thessalonians, that we work hard for ourselves, but also so that we can help other people and be good stewards of our blessings and assist those around us. The duty of man is to love God and obey him. And when this part is done correctly, when you have men and women working together in concert and understanding this heads off so many problems in relationships. If you have a man that is willing to provide for a woman and is capable of doing so and does, then that really stops a lot of marriage problems before they even start. Because if that is not taking place, that's like the bare minimum. That's the foundation. And if that part is not there, then that's causing so many problems in the marriage that are completely unnecessary. If you can establish that and take care of that, then you can start worrying about other issues in your marriage that are inevitably going to come up. But as long as that's being taken care of, that's a huge step in the right direction to having a godly household. That's something to keep in mind, because there are a lot of great women in the Bible, and we need to emphasize the lessons that their stories teach us, both as men and women. Stay the course, friends.